This podcast describes events that may be disturbing to some listeners, including violent assault and stalking. Please take care while listening.
On Wisconsin, runs right through that line. Run the ball clear round Chicago, touchdown, sure this time, you rock, rock. On Wisconsin, fight on for her fame. Fight, fellows, fight, 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 we'll win this game.
You're listening to Dakota Spotlight. My name is James Woolner. This is Season 10, You Killed Chris, A Friend's Fight for Justice. Welcome to Episode 3.
For it seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate.
Law and order have broken down in Detroit, Michigan.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
There it was, Christine Rothschild, murdered on campus.
Yeah, I remember Christine, and I've always wondered, who for sure actually killed her.
She says, I think he followed me from by Memorial Union.
In her book titled Murder on the 56th Day, Linda Schulkel explains that Christine Rothschild's life at the University of Wisconsin-Madison was punctuated in part by routines. For one, Christine woke up very early each morning, earlier than the average college student. Christine apparently had difficulty sleeping each night. Linda suggests this was possibly due to overstimulation from coffee and cigarettes. Or perhaps it was her health that kept her up. She suffered from colitis, which is inflammation of the large intestine. It can cause severe pain, fever, dehydration, and other health issues. So each morning, Christine woke in her first-floor private room at Ann Emery Hall on Langdon Street. After showering in the restroom down the hall, she got dressed, got ready, and then she engaged in the second part of her morning routine, her early morning walk. Her route may have very well varied a little each day. Sometimes she walked along Lake Mendota and other areas on campus where she could get closer to nature. Linda recalls that Christine liked gathering pine cones, acorns, and wildflowers along the way. Linda was never invited on these morning walks with Christine. She believes her friend Chris simply needed time alone and preferred the early mornings before the UW campus would be flooded with students, shattering the peace and quiet on campus. Sometimes Christine would stop for a coffee and a cigarette. One of her destinations was a drugstore named Rennebaum's, known locally as Rennie's. Rennie's was a chain of drugstores, not the pharmacy type of today, more the soda fountain style of yesteryear, with a long counter that served everything from ice cream shakes to grilled cheese sandwiches. Christine frequented two outlets of the Rennie's chain, one on State Street and another at 1357 University Avenue. She was often the very first customer of the morning. At Rennie's, Christine would sit and sip her coffee and smoke her cigarettes. Apparently, she always sat alone. After her coffee and cigarette break, Christine would make another brief stop along her walk. This spot on the UW campus was very near the University Avenue Rennie's drugstore. It was just up the street and around the corner, a spot right outside a building that is now known as the Medical Sciences Building, but back then served as University Hospital. Here is Linda Schulkel again.
I knew she met a group of staff. I don't know what positions they had at the hospital, young people that would meet at the emergency entrance there over on Charter Street, on the Charter Street side of University Hospital.
This location, the spot where ambulances would enter and exit the emergency room courtyard, was virtually right across the street from the entrance to Sterling Hall, the location where Christine would be found murdered behind a thicket of bushes next to the front steps.
And I think she became familiar with them because they were smoking, and of course Chris smoked. So, she introduced herself probably at some early point and became friends with this small group. And they kind of met at the same time every morning before shift or whatever it was. And they'd have a cigarette and say hi and talk for a few minutes, and then she'd move on and they'd go back to work.
And Christine, assumingly, would go back to her dorm or the library, or on weekdays, perhaps she went to her morning class.
Escape! Come on over to Royal Crown Cola. It's a mad, 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 mad cola. RC, the one with the mad, mad taste. Better shake that cola's drag. Check the one that's really mad. It's a mad, 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 mad cola. RC, the one with the mad, mad taste. RC.
There were no classes that morning on Sunday, May 26th, but of course, Chris had a routine, and so she woke up early as usual. When investigators would later search her dorm room, they would discover the remnants of Christine's last breakfast, a partially eaten can of spinach, perhaps a diet influenced by her condition. On her way to the showers, she passed the person last known to have seen her alive, a house mother, Gertrude Armstrong. Miss Armstrong would tell a news reporter, quote, "She came out of her room headed for the bathroom in her nightgown. We almost ran into each other." It was a somewhat dreary and cloudy day with expected rain. Christine left Anne Emery Hall wearing a blue miniskirt, knee-high boots, and a 3/4-length tweed coat. She had her gloves with her and carried an umbrella. She took with her her key to her dorm room, her cigarettes, and some money for coffee. And then she left Anne Emery Hall for the last time. That evening, a student and maintenance worker named Philip was heading over to Sterling Hall to see his buddy. Philip scooted up the stone steps in front of Sterling and grabbed the door. Unfortunately, it was locked. But apparently, Philip's friend was working on the ground floor, or possibly the basement floor. So Philip got an idea. He could get his friend's attention through a window. All he had to do was rap on the right one, and his buddy could come and let him in. Moments later, Philip was on the phone with the police. A woman. And blood. Lots of blood. Because the murder took place on the campus, the University of Wisconsin-Madison Police Department owned this case. It had been 10 years since UW had had a murder, and that one had been open and shut. In fact, that murder took place inside Sterling Hall. An argument between two researchers had gotten out of hand. UW's police chief, Ralph Hansen, knew immediately that he would need some assistance on this one. He asked for help from the state crime lab, as well as from Madison City Police and the county sheriff. Madison PD sent over Detective Charles Lulling. From the county sheriff's office, Captain Dick Josephson arrived at the crime scene. An autopsy would later show she had been stabbed 14 times in the breasts, chest, and neck. She had also been strangled with part of the lining of her coat. Apparently, the weapon used could have been similar to a surgeon's scalpel. Robbery did not appear to be the motive. Christine still wore 2 expensive rings, one on each hand. But her gloves were not on those hands. They had instead been shoved down Christine's throat by her killer. Oddly, a handkerchief, which has been described as an expensive man's hanky, was folded neatly and resting under Christine's head. Next to Christine's body, they discovered her umbrella and her plastic case containing her room key. Christine was not carrying any identification, and so for the moment, she was a Jane Doe. The University Hospital was just across the street from Sterling Hall. The body was loaded on a stretcher and taken to the hospital, transferred to a gurney, and then rushed into an empty emergency room. A nurse suggested that they take a look at the labels of the clothing. Maybe that would give them a clue about her identity. The name Christine Rothschild was embroidered on a fancy clothing tag. The first newspaper coverage was the very next afternoon in the local paper, the Capital Times. The story was front page with a headline across the top that read, "Co-ed stabbed 14 times." There were 2 articles, one with the headline, "Police Search for Clues in UW's Slaying," and another article with a photo of Christine and the headline, "Christine, she had a smile for everyone." Also on that front page was a photograph taken from the top steps of Sterling Hall and overlooking the crime scene after Christine's body had been removed. The photographer had been looking down from above and captured 2 Dane County sheriff's officers with flashlights investigating the scene late into the evening. One of the men in that photograph in 1968 was Dick Josephson.
I think at that time I was probably only a sergeant.
Today, Dick Josephson is 90 years old.
Well, number one, that was 56 years ago. It's a long time ago. Yeah, I remember Christine, and I have always wondered, who for sure actually killed her. I know our department processed that scene, and because it was a major crime for as far as UWPD was at the time. Our lab technicians processed the scene, yes, for several hours. Probably 8 or 9 hours, probably, I don't know. But they were there a long time.
Back then, in May of 1968, the University Police Department had 63 officers. Because of the timing of the murder, just 1 week before classes would end and students would vacate the campus for summer, much of the UWPD staff had been scheduled to go on leave. Chief Hansen ordered his staff to stay on, and eventually he would promise a month's vacation to any of his staff who could crack this case. From day one, it seemed the case was going to be difficult. There were no witnesses, and it was in the days before security and surveillance cameras could be found in front of every building. Just 2 days into it, law enforcement were already making statements to the media that this might be a tough case to crack. A task force was created, composed of 6 university police officers and 4 detectives from other agencies. The case went cold during the first week.
When you've got a job to do, reach for something good to chew. Chewing helps you stand the pace. Anytime and any place. So hi-ho, hey, hey, chew your little troubles away. Hi-ho, hey, hey, chew Wrigley Spearmint Gum. Work goes faster, smoother too. Life seems brighter when you chew. Hi-ho, hey, hey, chew Wrigley Spearmint Gum.
Senator Robert Kennedy has won his first crucial test in the Indiana primary, beating both Senator Eugene McCarthy and favorite son candidate Governor Roger Brannigan. With nearly all of the votes counted, Kennedy leads with 42% of the vote. Brannigan has 31%, McCarthy 27%. Former Vice President Richard Nixon rolled up heavy vote totals as the only person listed on the Republican ballot.
Before we continue, I think we need to stop and think about memory for a second. It will come in very handy and help the pieces of this story fall into place a little more elegantly as we move along. I'd like to ask you to imagine a tragic and fatal event and an array of people associated with it. Witnesses to the event, first responders, reporters, but also friends and loved ones of the deceased. Now imagine you want to tell a story about that event some 50 years later. You have a few sources at your disposal. You have the present-day recollections of witnesses and loved ones of the victim. These sources retell the event to you as they remember it now, 50 years later. You also have records of statements made directly after the event occurred. Perhaps a witness gave a statement to the police, or a family member talked to a reporter the day after their loved one died. On top of that, you have statements made throughout the years. You're hoping to tell the most accurate story possible, but unfortunately, things don't line up 100% of the time. There are discrepancies every which way between these many tellings throughout the years. Which of these accounts are likely to be the most accurate? Statements done the day after an event, those done 25 years later, or your present-day interviews 50 years after the fact? Of course, the answer seems to be incredibly obvious. Certainly, the original statements would be most accurate because memory fades over time. Yet, it is also recognized that we remember important events better than insignificant ones. The more monumental the event, the more we remember them. But studies of human memory have shown that even those memories are not as ironclad as we think. When study participants are asked 3, 5, 10, or 20 years later, their memories have changed. Sometimes shifted just a smidgen, sometimes a lot. Memories can become contaminated by other sources, and it turns out humans are not so good at keeping it all straight. Ever hear yourself say, "I'm not sure if I was there myself or if someone told me this story, but..." When it comes to long-term memory, we just have a hard time keeping our sources straight. It's human nature. So then, the earliest recorded account is the most reliable, right? Well, maybe, but not always. Sometimes the passage of time is actually helpful in getting closer to accuracy. Studies also show you must take into account the emotional state of the individual at the time they were interviewed or questioned. If a family member or loved one is interviewed immediately while in shock or experiencing trauma and overwhelming grief, they may not be able to make much sense of anything. Everything is upside down at the moment. For them, waiting a week, a month, or more can actually be beneficial. Memories can come back and sort themselves out. It's helpful, I think, to keep all of this in mind as we continue on with this story. When Christine Rothschild was murdered, it's certain her family were devastated with grief, but so were Christine's friends, people like Linda Schulkel. When Linda left the UW campus to go home for that summer, only a week had passed since the murder. Linda left Madison in a daze. But something probably happened to her over that summer of 1968. As time progressed, perhaps the level of grief or shock began to wane a little, and her mind managed to sift and sort through everything she had seen and everything she had heard during her relatively short friendship with Christine Rothschild. Something wasn't right. Something needed to be sorted out.
I was riddled with guilt, terrible, terrible guilt, after speaking to Henderson on the phone.
The Henderson that Linda is referring to was the police officer who had called Linda while she was working on her term paper. The cop had asked her if she knew of any co-eds that had pursued Christine romantically. There were many, she knew, but she blurted out the name of a young man who had been perhaps a little more interested than the others.
And I had not the slightest feeling that that man had done anything to hurt Chris.
And then, suddenly, clarity. A memory returned to her. It had taken its sweet time, but once it worked its way to the surface again, Linda was flabbergasted she hadn't seen it all clearly right away. Maybe it was the way Officer Henderson had asked the question in the first place. Maybe it was the shock at the time. Maybe it was both. Yes, there were many co-eds who were interested in Christine, but somehow Linda had, until this moment, blocked out someone else entirely. Not a co-ed, a grown man. A persistent and, in fact, annoying older man. And he had been very interested in Christine.
And I kept thinking about it. I thought, my God, why didn't I mention Niels Jorgensen to that officer?
Niels Jorgensen was a 42-year-old resident surgeon at the University Hospital just across the street from Sterling Hall. As we learned earlier, Christine would occasionally stop to have a smoke with a group of hospital employees near the emergency room entrance.
I remember her telling me one day, she said, this oddball old man, she said, he's really obnoxious, she says. And she says, and I hate to, she always like, kind of would pre-preface what I said, I hate to be so negative about this, instead of just coming right out, he's really very derogatory to the other people that I'm having a cigarette with. And he makes all of us kind of feel ill at ease, like we don't know what to say to him instead of being outright mean. Like how to, they didn't know how to tolerate him because he was so much older than them. He was 42 at the time and Chris was 18. And I'm assuming the people she was smoking with were probably in their early 20s, perhaps. He's there all the time. And she says, every time we have our morning cigarette break, he's always there. And she says, the weirdest part, Linda, she'd always say, is that he's always condemning us for smoking, telling us it's not a healthy habit and it stinks and so forth. And she says it's kind of peculiar. And she said, and he brags all the time, and he's always so negative about the other staff members and doctors by name. And Chris was not comfortable with this. She wasn't the type to stand in a group and say, I know so-and-so, and this is my opinion, of that person. She was kinder than that. She would keep it to herself. But she said, he's just kind of obnoxious. And she says, I don't know how to get rid of him. Well, I told her right out. I said, just tell him to F off. I said, just tell him if he doesn't like smoking and he, has nothing positive to say, move on. But that was me. And she would laugh and laugh, and she'd go, yeah, that's fine. That solved the whole problem. And then every day I would hear a little more about him. Memorial Library had a reading room on the first floor, a large room with real long tables. It was a huge room. And she would study there because it was on the bottom of the hill, only about a block and a half from her dorm. She said, she says, I could be wrong, she said, but, and how she'd always preface it. She said, I think he's kind of there all the time. Like, she says, he's like a few rows away from me, and he always seems to be facing me. One time she was going outside for a smoke break, and she really got irked because she said, I knew when I went out, he was following me out, because as soon as I got up, he got up, and it was a huge room. On the side entrance, when you walk down the steps, there used to be two big cement, like embankments on both sides where you could sit. She would sit there and have her cigarette always, because you always had to take a smoke break. And she said, and he came up to me and he asked me out. And I said, oh, like you must be kidding. And she says, and I told him no, that, I really wasn't into dating, and I was kind of a serious student and kind of a loner. She said, I told him, and she says, I thought it was kind of clear. And he asked if she had a boyfriend, and she says, no. Every day, it seemed like off and on, every few days perhaps, he would follow her out for a smoke break. Well, finally, she decided that isn't working at all because she would ignore him like she couldn't talk, and she'd put out her cigarette and go back in. Well, anyways, he followed her to the bathroom one day on the first floor, and he waited outside the woman's restroom. Then I was really upset. She said I was angry because she said I felt like he was, in those days we'd say stuff like shadowing, because the word stalking wasn't even in our vocabulary. I don't know that the word even existed. And she said he was waiting outside of the restroom. She says, can you imagine that? A man standing right outside of the woman's restroom waiting? You know, it's not like his girlfriend went in for a second. And she said, and he just doesn't seem to get it. She says, I tell him I don't want to go out. Thank you, but no, I'm not interested. And she said that I'm just kind of here to study. And he stopped coming for a while to the reading room. So she thought, it's all over. And then she told me one night when she called, she said that I think he followed me that from the outside of my Memorial Union, which was across the street, she says, to my dorm. And I said, what made you think that? And she says, because I stopped to talk for a minute with somebody on the way to the dorm. And when I turned around, I saw him there. She says, it just was kind of peculiar. She would tell me these things more and more. He just was like a presence in her life.
"10 days into the investigation of Christine's murder, UWPD's task force were chasing several leads, but somehow the case was already feeling cold. And elsewhere, another homicide took place that would once again shock the nation. Robert Kennedy was gunned down while campaigning for the presidency.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible? It could. Is it possible, ladies and gentlemen? It is possible. He has. Not only Senator Kennedy. Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot. And another man, a Kennedy campaign manager, and possibly shot in the head. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. That's it, Rafer. Get it. Get the gun, Rafer. Okay, now hold on to the guy. Hold on to him. Hold on to him, ladies and gentlemen. Hold him. Hold him. We don't want another Oswald. Hold him, Rafer. We don't want another Oswald. Hold him, Rafer. Keep people away from him.
The body of Senator Robert Kennedy is now in the air in a jet furnished by the White House and the Air Force, heading for New York from Los Angeles. It left there a little bit before 4:30 New York time this afternoon. It will land at LaGuardia Airport in New York. The body will be brought to St. Patrick's Cathedral, arriving sometime around 9:30 New York time tonight. Tomorrow from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., and longer if there are lines there, it will lie in state before a Requiem Mass at 10 a.m. Saturday, then to go by train from New York to Washington, and in a motor procession from New York's Union Station to go by the Senate Office Building and by the Justice Department, where Robert Kennedy served as Attorney General, before burial at about 5:30 Saturday afternoon in the same plot where President John Kennedy lies.
She's got the look. Go lightly. The radiant look. Go lightly. The natural look. Go lightly. The look you want. A look like this doesn't just happen, but you can create it with Go Lightly. Go Lightly, an entirely new kind of milk from Meadow Gold, to make you look as good as you'll feel. Go Lightly is only 1% fat, but it has 20% more protein.
One night when I called her, she answered the phone kind of rudely. It wasn't that she said anything, it's that she didn't say anything. And I remember saying something like, "Are you there?" Oh, she says, "Oh, it's you." She said, "I'm sorry." She says, "I just got some disturbing phone calls." And she says, and I just hung up, and I thought maybe it was another one. And then she told me about these hang-ups that had been starting. And then as another week or so progressed, he was saying something to her, and I have never been told by her at that. I was never told by her at that point if it was dirty or sexually oriented or provocative or whatever. She would not repeat it. But she says he's got a dirty mind. That was about the extent of what she would say about it. And it got really bad because one night when she called, she said to me, I'm not going to open my window anymore. And it was kind of warm. It was kind of muggy. And she didn't have air conditioning, and neither did I. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, I think it was him standing a few feet from my bushes. And I said, when? And she said, last night. She said I was going to pull the shade down because she was on the left-hand side of the building on the first floor. Right off of the lobby, you would go to the left, and there would be rooms there, single rooms. And she says, and there was a bush right by her window. And she says, I'm sure it was him. And she says, what would he be doing standing over there? There's nothing there to really stand for, you know. And she says, so I'm going to keep my blinds closed. She went from like mild aggravation, where he was starting to complain initially about the smokers and about other staff members, to kind of concern like, this isn't a good person. You know, it's not good to be even in his company. And the fact that he's kind of following me, to the point of she developed fear. And that's how it was progressing. And I don't know at what point she actually developed a fear. But I think it's when that happened, which had to be close to when the semester ended, that she stopped on Bascom, at the top of Bascom there, and talked to Officers Golem and Frey.
That's right. According to Linda and her book, Christine did report this harassment to law enforcement. Linda says that Christine called her one evening and said she'd stopped 2 officers at the top of Bascom Hill and reported Jorgensen by name. She told them everything, his shadowing, hang-up calls, possibly standing outside of her dorm room window. According to Linda, the police officers told her to buy a whistle. Linda would not learn the names of those 2 officers for another 40 years. Once Linda realized that she had somehow completely blanked on the old oddball surgeon at the hospital named Niels Jorgensen, who had shown more than just a little interest in Christine, she was plagued with guilt and decided to right her wrong. She picked up the phone and called the University of Wisconsin-Madison Police Department.
I called on a Sunday night, and I remember so well that some officer picked up the phone, and I said, I'm calling about my girlfriend, Christine, who was murdered on May 26th. And I said, I'd like to speak with somebody who's working on the case. I mean, I didn't even think in terms of the word detective in those days. And he said, yeah, no problem. He says, I'll give him the message. And he hung up. And he no sooner hung up, and I thought, you don't even know my name. You don't have a callback number. You have nothing. And I was angry, but I was 18 years old, you know. And so I had a friend who was a nun, and she and I were in the same class together on campus. And I had mentioned one time about Chris, and she knew who Chris was by, in the newspaper. That was it. She hadn't been on campus at that point. Anyways, and I says, what should I be doing? And she said, you need to make contact with the police again, Linda. She said, you need to talk to them.
And so Linda made another attempt in a manner she felt comfortable with at the age of 18.
We had inter-office or inter-campus mail, those envelopes where it says, they're brown and they got kind of holes, and it says to, from, and you cross it out, and then you put your name and to and from on the next line, and that envelope is probably used 100 times because there's 100 different slots on it. Anyway, so I sent a message to the police department through the inter-campus mail, and I remember I rewrote it a few times, and I had all my information as far as my name, address, and phone number and everything, where I lived on campus. And I said, my friend was murdered. And I said, and I think I have information that I need to talk to you about because I had a conversation with an officer and it wasn't really accurate on my part. I said, could you please call me?
Linda never heard back from UWPD.
So at that point, I gave up on the system. And of course, I wasn't in, if it were now, I would have been knocking on the door and saying, I want to speak to, whoever's chief now or who's ever sergeant in command, whatever. I was a totally different, I had a different makeup at that time. I was brought up that priests and teachers and firemen and and cops were all to be respected, and whatever they said goes, And so you didn't question things, but I knew something was wrong, and I was more determined than ever that I'm done talking to people because they're not listening, and I'm just going to have to work this through myself and figure out what needs to be done and how. I think this was a natural way for me to deal with the problem. I had to find a solution for it, but I couldn't depend. I couldn't depend outside of myself for the answers at that point. So it seemed normal to me. It seemed very normal. I thought everybody did this. I mean, in my mind, it was like that's what everybody would do, and that led me on my life chase.
Still yet to come on future episodes of You Killed Chris, One Friend's Fight for Justice.
Excuse the inconvenience of this letter, but I'm just trying to find a relationship to see if I can find this person or whatever.
Why did I even hire this idiot?
Sometimes everything isn't okay.
My name was cleared, but it was Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I was involved in some other things, namely espionage overseas.
The very next morning, we called the police department and said, could this be him?
He lied about his family. He lied about his role in the World War.
Dakota Spotlight is written and produced by me, James Wallner, and is a proud member of the Porchlight Podcast Network. A huge thank you goes out to Linda Schulko for her willingness to share her story with us. Check out her Kindle book, Murder on the 56th Day, available on Amazon.com. Linda donates all her proceeds from the book to charity. She requests you order the Kindle version and not the printed copy, as she no longer has copies available. I also recommend Kevin Damask's book titled Cold, The Unsolved Murders of 7 Young Women. See the links to both books in the show notes. A very special thanks goes out this season to Mari Zoerb Hansen, a 4th-generation UW alum, for all the amazing research, fact-checking, and just stellar assistance with this season. Mari's dedication and hard work on this story is in the memory of her late father, David Zoerb, who was finishing his senior year at UW when Christine was murdered. Thank you, Mari. Contact me by email at dakotaspotlight@gmail.com. Don't miss the amazing Dakota Spotlight Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Dakota Spotlight. This story took place over 50 years ago, and memories undoubtedly have shifted and evolved with time. Individuals impacted by this crime and others who have looked into this case may have different accounts of events in this story. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.